Hello, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece. So it's now mid-December and I'm taking a break over the Christmas period and month of January. Though before signing off for the holidays, I wanted to leave you all with a different sort of episode to see out the year. I decided to contact my good friend Steve over at the Spartan History Podcast to see if he'd be interested in coming on just to talk about Greek history. He has just entered into the Greek and Persian War period, so I thought it would provide lots for us to talk about. Plus it gave me another reason to go back and chat about the Persian Wars, a period I always enjoy talking about. It had also been quite some time since we last did a collaboration, so I thought it was about time to get on air and have a chat. I also felt we had reached a natural point to take a break in the series since we just wrapped up the First Peloponnesian War, but don't worry, we will be back to continue with the developments in the new year. For those of you who have not come across the Spartan History Podcast, I would highly recommend you check out Steve's show. He began around the same time I started this show, and we have since kept in touch and bounced ideas with one another. You can find the Spartan History Podcast on the same platforms you listen to this show. So, for this episode, we decided not to worry about any sort of script or pre-planned direction for the chat. It just basically unfolded as if we were chatting together without any audience. We focus a great deal on the Greco-Persian Wars, jumping around the period a bit, while we also do touch on areas before and after the conflict. We did have a few connection issues throughout the talk, with a dropout and some areas of buffering, though I did try and smooth them out as best as I could, but they are still there. Anyway, a huge thank you to everyone for listening and supporting the show. I greatly appreciate it. Although I'm taking the rest of December and January off, I just want to let all the Patreon members know that I'll still be releasing the next bonus episode in the first week of January. So, with all that out the way, let's get to the episode, and I hope you enjoy the change of pace with this more casual approach. Hello everyone, Mark here from Casting Through Ancient Greece, and tonight I'm joined by Steve from the Spartan History Podcast. How you going, Steve?
G'day, Mark. Long time no see.
Yeah, it's been a while since we've done one of these. I think our last collaboration was well over a year ago.
I'm thinking it was the middle of 2021, actually, and the world was a far different place back then.
Yes.
For better or for worse. Yeah, no, good to see you.
Yeah, you too. So it's mid-December now, and so I decided to take a bit of a break from my narrative episodes, my scripted episodes, and thought I'd just do something a bit more casual, and thought what better, project to do than have just a casual chat with Steve over at Spartan History Podcast. So looking forward to it anyway.
Oh, it's probably a good time. I mean, you've just obviously wrapped up your Greco-Persian War series and I'm still in the thick of it. So as always, we're probably going to have a fair bit to chat about. So no, looking forward to the discussion.
Absolutely. I was looking forward to this because for everyone that hasn't listened to Steve's podcast yet, he's just entered into the Greco-Persian War period. I think your last one was on the Battle of Marathon, wasn't it?
Correct. I'm riding on the coattails of Casting Through Ancient Greece. as I always have been, really.
It's we're approaching it from different standpoints. I think I give Sparta a bit of a summary treatment through all sides a bit of a summary treatment, where you go a bit deeper into the Spartan side of things. Yeah. My main goal actually in coming into it, and I've got plans for the Peloponnesian War in the same sort of vein, but was to really tell it from the Spartan side, and that was the choice that I made moving into the period. But I think as you probably appreciate that it's incredibly difficult to just tell parts of the story. I mean, the Greco-Persian Wars it's such a conglomerate of events, like with the different battles and the timeline itself, that just telling the Spartan element of it, you basically would have started in pre-Thermopylae. And then work through from there, and you had a totally missed marathon because the Spartans were a big non-event. So I ended up having to, rescind my earlier process and sort of taking it from a more general point of view, which is strange when you're the Spartan History Podcast to do an episode entirely on Athens. But it just, for context's sake, it sort of, it makes it fit a little bit better. Yeah. I guess before we get too deep into it, just in case people haven't heard our last collaboration, do you just want to give a bit of a rundown of what Spartan History Podcast is?
Yeah, sure. I guess, in looking to do a podcast, a bit like yourself, I think, we'd probably come off the back of some great history podcasters that have gone before us. And, you try to search for that point of difference, I suppose. And a Roman history podcast would have been my first choice, but there's a few brilliant ones out there. But I've always had a deep and abiding love for Sparta and Spartan history. My son has the name of a long dead Spartan king, Leonidas, and that was all something that was calling to me. So I thought it might be an opportunity to tell the Spartan story in total. You know, not just the glory parts, the Battle of Thermopylae and the Battle of Plataea, but to tell the whole story, which doesn't really get a lot of focus, as you would well know, working in that space as well. So I thought I'd start it from the start. Which is, I'm actually a big person on dichotomies, and Sparta's full of dichotomies, not just from having, you know, two kings, but it's got a very distinct Bronze and Iron Age phase as well. So I started it with the start, which was with Helen of Sparta and the ancient Spartans with Menelaus, and carried that right through the Archaic and Dark Age and smack bang into the Iron Age. So it's a chronological history of Sparta itself. And anybody who started in episode 1 hoping to, surely disappointed now that 35 episodes in, we haven't quite got to that point, but I promise any of my listeners who are listening to this podcast and anybody who likes to come on board, we'll get there very shortly.
Yes, that's we're looking forward to it anyway. Sorry, I think we had a few buffers there, but hopefully that irons out in the editing.
Well, that's between you and what it was, Audacity, I suppose.
Yes.
Good luck.
Exactly. So yeah, like you touched on, obviously there's not so much written about, I guess, Sparta itself by any Spartans. So how have you approached, I guess, when you got a whole podcast that's looking at Sparta, how do you go about getting your information and your sources for your subject?
Very tough, especially when it comes to the pre-Greco-Persian War period, where they definitely come onto the scene. But there's glimmers of them before that. But I think taking the lead of some really preeminent scholars in the field, I've used a combination of archaeology, of ethnography, in order to get a feel for the timber, I suppose, of the Spartan people by comparing them via ethnography to other similar sorts of cultures, to try and tease out a little bit of that detail there, and really just from a deep, broad dive into the histories that we have, and I think we were just talking before we came on air about not being able to throw any sources away, and you definitely can't do that with Sparta. You've got to take a lot of things with a grain of salt, but in order to get as full a picture as possible, you need to take everybody up into Plutarch, who was writing often 600 years after the events that he's describing. And then you've also got with Sparta, you've got the extra layer of complexity, and perhaps you can tell me a little bit about the Athens side of things after I finish. But you've got the Spartan mirage, which is also incredibly difficult to pierce, and it was something that even Greek historiographers in the 5th century were aware of as a phenomenon. So yeah, look, it's not easy, and I certainly don't claim to know it all, but I definitely haven't left any stone unturned throughout the journey. I've passed out about just about every detail that I could think of in the story, and it's not a complete picture, but it's as good as I can make it. So yeah, in answer to your question, I've just taken everything I could possibly find and try to make a narrative out of it. Yeah,
and it's very similar to what I've done. Obviously, I'm not trying to dig as deep into Sparta, but I try and give Spartan perspective on a lot of things as well. And you just have to work with the sources that you do have, and I guess almost judge events as they unfold and try and, I guess, extrapolate from those of what may have been going on previously. Obviously, there's not much known of the internal workings of the politics within Sparta, but you sort of try and have your best guess based on what they decide to do to a certain event. This is a problem I've been facing, especially doing the 50-year period between the Greco-Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War, where even for majority of Greece, even with Athens, you're dealing with just summary sort of treatment of the whole period, and so let alone Sparta, trying to work out what's happening, it can be quite difficult.
Did you find? You've obviously looked at Athens pretty strongly, strictly. Is there a mirage per se with the Athenians? I mean, you don't really hear about it mentioned of, but having looked at the sources, having looked at the stories, do you see two Athens forming in the historical record or not?
I think you need to be careful of the sources. You need to understand the time they were writing and why they present certain things as they do. Like, I think the biggest that you probably have maybe come across is with Corinth during the Greco-Persian Wars, and how Athens presents Corinth. That obviously they don't treat them too nicely through their actions during the Greco-Persian Wars, but it appears that they would probably actually perform quite well, and did as they were supposed to do on the battlefield and on the water. But it seems, obviously, when Herodotus is writing, it's during the period where tensions are really heating up, and a lot of the tensions between Athens and Corinth are taking place as well. So I think that has a bit to play as well. And perhaps even stuff to do with Thebes, Thermopylae. I don't know. I'm not convinced that they were just they were hostages forced to fight. I think maybe they were part of the opposing faction within Thebes that chose to fight on their own behalf.
Yep. I agree with that, actually. Yeah.
So I think it is a lot more. It's not so much just taking what the accounts at face value. You kind of need to understand who the historian is, what time period they're writing in, what was the general view, or what was the geopolitical situation in that time, and then that allows you to build sort of an understanding of perhaps why things are being presented the way they are. And and then obviously too, a lot of writers in Athens receive patronage too, so it's certain figures talked up more so than put on a bit of a pedestal more so than what they should have been, or that type of thing. Like, I wonder, I mean, this is all, I guess, just sort of wondering in my own mind, things to do, especially with like Miltiades at Marathon. Obviously he's presented as quite the hero at Marathon, and of his dealings, and Callimachus, who was the actual main general who was killed in battle, is that the reason that we don't really hear much about him? Because whatever he did leading up to that is forgotten about because he died. Miltiades is the hero, and not by coincidence, during that time that all this was being written down, his son Carmen was influential in Athenian politics. And so how much of that has influenced what we hear today? So it's just a lot of those sorts of things that go on.
Yeah, you actually see to talk about a dynamic a little bit, you talk about patronage, and I've often been quite amused about certain plays by Aristophanes, the comic, and he often, I think the gentleman's name was Cleon, I think, at the time, and Aristophanes, has an absolute lend of him, left, right, and centre, and a lot of his works there. He's often the butt of a lot of jokes. Him and Euripides actually, stand up for a fair bit of that comic's wit, and I've always wondered, what was their dynamic like off the stage, because you would think in that sort of setting that somebody trying to run you down, would be harmful for your political career, but Cleon's political career was was quite meteoric, so it was almost like a bit of a love-hate relationship in the background. The dynamic of the patronage, was Cleon actually patronizing Aristophanes in some of his work? It's sort of a bit tough to say. It's a very similar dynamic to how much influence Cimon had over the Athenian democracy, in regards to his father. Because, his father, if you can take Herodotus at his word, was basically the antithesis of what Athenian democracy stood for. He was a tyrant. He was in service to Darius, and I think if you look at that incident coming over the bridge in northern Thrace, there he was one of the members that was, well, not outrightly supporting Darius's campaigns. In fact, he was on the other side, but he was there nonetheless. In the pay of the Persians. So it's a very Miltiades' story is a fascinating one. There's so many little tidbits in Herodotus' narrative, but not enough to make a full read on. He was at Marathon. Obviously, was one of the polemarchs for the battle itself. But how he sort of slotted back into the Athenian democracy and was relatively lauded as a hero after the event. Of course, he fell from grace pretty quickly, but very interesting dynamic there.
It seems to be a common theme in Athenian politics. These war heroes end up falling from grace pretty quickly soon after. But yeah, he was, I think from memory too, he was a tyrant in the Chersonese, wasn't he? And
absolutely, yeah.
And was, I think, even tried before he was elected a general in Athens, but managed to survive that and basically become elected. So yeah. I think you were talking about at the bridge too, the incident, a campaign into Scythia, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
And I think was it him that was saying, trying to convince everyone to basically break the bridge down so the Persians would be trapped within Scythia. And
yeah.
But anyway, he managed to. He must have been quite a sweet talker. I guess I think in politics you've got to be have your wits about you and be able to talk the talk, don't you?
I think personally that's. I mean, Herodotus obviously cooks up some pretty interesting stories to flesh out his narrative, but I think that's his way of, and I didn't come up with this. I read this somewhere, and it rings true. His way of sort of softening the image of Miltiades before he becomes back as this all period at this very, very early period. And he was exhibiting that at the bridge into Scythia. So yeah.
Yeah, and that's and the interesting thing is, I guess it's probably worthwhile to say is, even though we talk about tyrants and Athens is connected with democracy, but originally a tyrant wasn't exactly the worst thing in the world during this period as well. It was basically a different kind of leader, I guess, gaining power through irregular means, but it didn't necessarily mean that you were power hungry, ruthless killer. Often, most of these tyrants had to be popular leaders. They had to have the popular support to be able to rule in their own right anyway. I think it's a bit later where tyrant starts to get that negative connotation. And you even find a lot of writers, I found it interesting too, like even Herodotus himself, he can detect that they seem a bit hostile towards the idea of democracy. They seem a lot more, I guess, in line with the idea of an aristocracy having control of the government. And I guess a lot of these guys, they did come from those sorts of family lines as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the key point. Everybody that we read about, all the people doing the writing, were part of the aristocracy. So naturally, that they were, pro-oligarchic, pro-tyrannical sorts of leaderships. Democracy. I mean, and I'm sure you've discussed this in brief. It's not what we call democracy these days. I mean, even the people that were considered available to well, good fun editing.
Yeah.
I basically just finished talking about tyrants and how Syracuse was, one of those places where tyrants were very, very much loved. They had tyrants for a very, very long time. Obviously, everyone that's listening in, we're having a few issues with the connection, but hopefully we'll just push on and see how we go. But yeah, so like I said, your latest episode was on Marathon, and you did that with Dr. Owen Rees.
Yes, which I had a bit of a chat to on another episode as well. But so I know obviously he wrote a book. I think it was Great Battles of the Ancient World or something like that. And he covers Marathon in that briefly, but obviously you would have had a much more in-depth conversation with him on the whole battle.
Yeah, he's fantastic. I mean, Owen's one of those guys that has a really an interesting take on things. Like he really, like, I love detail, but that man has got an absolute penchant for detail. So yeah, it was interesting and in depth, and I think his outlook on things, like he's very good at putting you in the mind of somebody that was on the battlefield. And I actually got a lot out of it. I know that you did an episode with him regarding, ancient forms of PTSD and psychological episodes in war. So we definitely touched on that a little bit towards the end because I didn't want to miss out on that. But it was fantastic insight just to, really get him into the depths of the battle itself, and just the way he, broke down the initial clash of arms and everything like that. There was actually a moment in our discussion where I was starting to sort of get, sweaty palms. You can almost feel the clash of Aspides against each other, and the whack of the Dori spear tips onto those Aspides as well. Like, he was really, really in depth, which is exactly what I wanted as well out of a discussion on the Battle of Marathon, because it really was to give Athenians, I'll say that as a true laconophile, to give the Athenians their due, out of everybody that could have, stood against the Persians and didn't, the Athenians were there. They marched out from their city, leaving their loved ones and their precious possessions behind to a uncertain fate, and they utterly crushed the Persians that were up against them. Whether the Persians were there for invasion or to pay them back for sticking the middle finger up to Darius some years previous. I don't think it really matters. I think you can't. And Owen was good in this regard too, that giving credit where credit's due. The Athenians went out there, they did something that had never been done before. An invading force from far away from a very powerful empire landing on Greek soil. They took it to them in relatively untested arms against that style of warfare, and they were victorious. And Owen really, he really brought it to life. It was fantastic.
Yeah, I think it's I guess now it's a bit of a stretch to try and say that it was an invasion of all of Greece, like trying to subjugate all of Greece, given the likely numbers that were sent over. I think at best it's estimated 25,000 Persians, perhaps. But and given what was taking place beforehand with all the landings on Naxos and Eritrea, and basically subjugating the populations, paying them back for participating in the Ionian revolt that took place, it perhaps seems that was what was more likely, maybe in that period. But again, I don't know. It's looking at other Persian campaigns in other areas of their empire. It seems that they lay a lot of groundwork. It's almost like it's a process that's slowly taking place over years, where they lay some groundwork, get some influence in areas, and then from there they can then move on. Whether it's a decade later or sometime later, once they've established certain places, as that's what it seems maybe was going on north with Mardonius when he went through Thrace and up towards Macedon 2 years earlier. It seemed like they were perhaps trying to establish certain camps and bases along the route, which bogged down and lost their fleet.
That was the Mount. That was the peninsula one, wasn't it? Where's all the monasteries are there?
Yeah, Mount Athos.
Athos, that's the one. Yeah. I missed that. I think you're right, because like we were saying before about using other likely pieces of history to try and figure out what was going on before. We know how the Persians went to war. We know how they did invasions. We saw it in Scythia with Darius. We saw that in Egypt with Darius as well. We saw that with Xerxes 10 years later, what the Persian empire looks like when they go to war. And I think, and when they go to invade. And I think, to call it anything other than just a punitive measure, at best, to try and, cut down the prideful Athenians and Eritreans. That's probably about where it needs to be at. And look, they were in the vicinity. They just suppressed the Ionian revolt, so they had armies nearby. That's quite a common feature of all armies throughout time, even modern armies for that matter. We saw that with the second American invasion of Iraq. They had a ready-made force basically ready to rock and roll, and it was a small thing. They just needed a pretext, and off they went to war over there. And I think that's probably likely all it was. They had a pretext, obviously the Ionian revolt, and they had an army that was willing and ready to go. So off they went. Yeah,
and especially once they were in Eritrea, it wasn't much of a jump to the Bay of Marathon.
Remarkably close, remarkably close.
And I guess that's where in this campaign too, there's a lot of questions that are left unanswered. This is why this is one of my favourite battles during the whole through of Greek history. There's just so many unanswered questions that remain of what was going on. For example, the cavalry. We hear about the cavalry transports that are constructed and made, but then the last time we hear about any cavalry is on Eritrea, and there's not a word about them at Marathon. And so we're left wondering, what role did they play? And there's perhaps little clues around the place that suggest one thing, but we can never be too certain as well. But did Owen go much into theories or ideas around the cavalry on the field of battle?
Yeah, well, he actually intimated, and I guess as you just alluded to, like the hints that you're getting around the side that perhaps the Athenian army either saw or thought that cavalry were in motion prior to fight in that particular day. Like Herodotus' narrative, you think, okay, yeah, I can sort of see where they're going from, but you're right. I mean, they don't take any part in the battle. I've been to Marathon, like it's certainly a good enough field to have cavalry on there, and it seems like a massive waste considering that's really where the Persian strength lie. It certainly wasn't in their men at arms and infantry. It was in their cavalry and their archers. To not have that on the battlefield is very, very surprising. But no, he didn't. Did he? Has he given you any indication as to what he thinks happened?
No, I mean, I didn't really. I haven't spoken at length with Owen on Marathon, but I have read some interesting. I've read an interesting book by a guy named James Lacey, and that tried to. I don't know if you've read that, and that tried to go into some of the, I guess, theories around some of the questions at Marathon. And his biggest one is, I mean, it was like 10 days of just stagnation in the field, and it's thought that perhaps the ships were preparing to load up to leave and sail around to Athens. And the idea was, I guess, try and keep the Athenian army held at Marathon, and then a force would be sent around to Athens to then take the city undefended. And it's thought that perhaps the cavalry were some of the first to be loaded up, since they would take the longest. And this may have been the whole, the catch cry of, I think it's in the Suda of cavalry away. And just then set into motion the charge across the field. And
it's a good story.
And perhaps that's, that the run across the field was so that they would get there in time before the cavalry could be, made ready to be able to join the battle. Because I think there's also, as a sarcophagus that depicts cavalry on it, and it's meant to depict the Battle of Marathon. So there's even thoughts of, did they get them ready, but they joined the battle once all the fighting was already joined, and so they didn't really have the shock factor.
Interesting. Yeah, right. Where's this sarcophagus? Where was it found?
It's one of the ones. I think it's you got the sarcophagus of. There's like one of Alexander the Great. There's one around Troy. I think if you Google it, you can find a picture of. There's I think 4 different sarcophaguses that depict different battles, and Marathon's supposed to be one of them.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, I mean, like you said, they were there for 10, 11 days. You need fodder for the horses, especially for that sort of period of time. And, how many horses were there? 5,000, 10,000 horses? That's a lot of fodder. They need to be watered as well. Not just to mention the amount of manpower you need to be able to stable them, obviously clean them, dress them. Like, cavalry are a very expensive and time consuming element. It's strange that they didn't make a part, especially when you do hear them distinctly mentioned as being on Eritrea in particular. So yeah, I mean, but yeah, not to skip over the cavalry side of things, but we mentioned Eritrea. Now there's something that I think it's maybe 8 or 10 lines in Herodotus, but my God, I wish he had have expanded on that. That would have been a truly terrifying event for the people at that island. You can imagine it, living relatively a peaceful existence. I know that there was some pretty big wars there, supposedly, back in the day, the Lelantine War in particular. But, to have an invading army come like that and just basically, burn the city to the ground and cut off the entire population into slavery, I think that could have been worth a little bit more of Herodotus' time, I feel.
Yeah, it seemed like a bit more of an epic battle than what was presented in the works, but I guess that wasn't the main focus, was it? So,
no. I guess the Eritrean prisoners can take solace from the fact that they got transported to the place where oil was first discovered. So, I'm not sure that makes them feel any better about it. But
no. Yes. So, I mean, we sort of, I guess, spoke a bit about the cavalry and ideas behind those ideas. Well, actually, another thing I was going to talk about was, it's interesting, they talk about, in the Persian line of battle, they talk about the saké that was in the center. And a lot of accounts talk about the saké being mounted in just about everything that's spoken about them. And they're always depicted as excellent horsemen and whatnot. So that's another interesting little idea of, were they there really? Who knows? Because they also are spoken about as being quite good Marines as well aboard Persian ships. So were they just perhaps some of the Marines that were formed up in battle? But these are all little interesting ideas that I guess still provide a lot of food for thought on that question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a funny one, like just thinking about it more broadly, and you probably are a little bit more across the detail than I am. But if you look at I guess the three, two, but three main set land battles that you have in the Greco-Persian War period, Thermopylae, Plataea, and Marathon, there's not really cavalry. They don't really play a big part in any of those three battles, So it's whether, Herodotus or the retellings of the battles, because he was dealing with, second and third hand sources for the most part, didn't mention it because it seems kind of strange. I get that that Thermopylae was, pretty condensed style of battle, and you probably wouldn't be charging, cavalry into that pass. Even the most foolish general would consider that a pretty ridiculous tactic. But Marathon certainly,
unless it's the movie. I was just going to say, unless it's the movie 300.
I didn't think we were going to mention 300. I thought I had your word on that.
Yeah. But yeah, it is interesting. Obviously, a lot of battles in Greece are not cavalry heavy, and I think that does come down to the terrain of Greece as well, because you see many armies, especially like the Spartans and Athenians, they don't focus on having cavalry as the backbone of their forces. It's only when you go north to Thessaly that they start talking about having excellent cavalry. And this was like, the pick of the cavalry for those armies later on. Thessalian cavalry were, I guess, sought after as well. And even where I'm up to now, Tanagra, they were part of that battle that which they switched sides during it, supposedly. But I think a great deal of why cavalry doesn't feature much is because the terrain just doesn't allow it in a lot of those areas in Greece.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's interesting. Thessaly, as you come out of the sort of the mountains north of Attica and you sort of descend in the Thessalian plain, it's probably the flattest section of Greece. Like, you can understand why horses and cavalry were prominent in that area. But yeah, you're right. Greece is a series of mountains with mountain passes, divided by small plains full of farmland. And if you think about the hoplite force, the phalanx, it was perfect for just blocking a pass. Like Thermopylae was the perfect setting for a Greek army in those times. And I think that's where they generally did their fighting. They'd march towards, say, Sparta was marching on Corinth or something like that, and they'd meet in a pass and they'd fight their battle there, and they'd go back to do their respective things. I don't think cavalry really became a part of it. But if you see the battlefield of Plataea, like that's perfect cavalry ground. You don't really hear anything about the cavalry. Certainly the archers. They make up a fairly good part of the battles that Herodotus records. But it's perfect room for cavalry charge there. And the Greek army was massive, and its line must have been quite protracted. But there was plenty of room to get a cavalry charge around the back of there. It's very strange that the Persians didn't employ that tactic, because they'd already experienced how deadly a phalanx was from front on. A simple thing to turn that line with a cavalry charge. Alexander the Great, 150 years later, that was the main part of his tactic was to lock up the enemy with a phalanx and then swoop in from the side and clean up with the cavalry. It sort of it almost makes sense. It's strange.
Yeah. Plataea had Roman cavalry for days that were harassing the Greeks. I think it was just isolated areas where there were rough ground that the Greeks tried to make use of to try and protect themselves from the Persian cavalry at that stage. But before we move on, we're not going to get out of this one. At Marathon, we only have Athens and the Plataeans that fought the Persians. So where were the Spartans, Steve?
Well, it depends on who you believe, doesn't it? The popular narrative is that they were off celebrating the Carnea and doing their dedications to Apollo, but you often find that for the Spartans, religious observance was often more of a convenience than it was a dictation by the gods. So, look, I actually think that there's something to esteem the writings of Plato. He suggests very loosely that perhaps they were experiencing a Helot revolt at that time, and I think there's a lot of credence in behind that, because if you look at the force that they sent to Marathon, which arrived late to the day, which is around 2,000 hoplites, I think. 10 years later, when they had a full Peloponnesian army at their backing, there were 6,000 Spartan homoioi, hoplites, which was, that was relatively a full contingent. They might have had a few, maybe another 1,000 to spare, which probably were, on guard duty during the latter phase. But yeah, no, you're right. The Spartans were absent. They were apparently quite congratulatory towards the Athenians for their victory, which is good to hear, because you wouldn't normally expect the Spartans to be, humble in that kind of setting, but apparently they were. But yeah, they weren't there. They were succinct by their absence, and I think that it was probably due to a Helot revolt, which seems to have been happening around about that time. It happened before. It happened afterwards as well with the earthquake that happened. And I can't remember which historian wrote it, but that most of Spartan's affairs, revolved around Helot revolts and keeping the Helots under the thumb, so to speak. So I'd say there's probably a little bit more credence to that. The Carnea certainly lines up with the time, but there's also the fact that the Spartans used a different calendar as well, and there's a thought that perhaps the Carnea may have been a month actually later than Marathon. It lines up with the Athenian time frame very well, but not so well with what we understand the Spartan time frame to do. So I'd say a likely Helot revolt would have kept them there.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously a lot of areas, even the Ionian Revolt and things like that, you see the Spartans are very reluctant to leave Laconia in any sort of numbers. And I think the one time that we see them depart, like you said, for Plataea, I think it was something like 35,000 Helots were then marched off with them as well. And so perhaps this was obviously they'd seen the dire need to actually oppose the Persians, and so we'll send our Helots with them, and that way there won't be a problem.
Yeah, that's actually, while you touched on, that's always struck me as a little bit strange. Like you think, is what's the number 1 to 7, homoioi to Helots at the Battle of Plataea. Very strange that you'd think that you'd take such a vastly overwhelming force that was we're led to believe that they were, indentured slaves of the worst kind. That they were, basically chattel for the Spartans. But yet they take them out of the Peloponnese on campaign. It wasn't unheard of in those days for sides or for forces at the last minute to turn coat. Would there not have been a wily Persian? Demaratus, for example, was, in the entourage of the Persians, at least at some stage, perhaps not at Plataea, but he was definitely there earlier on, that he might not have said, oh, by the way, these guys, don't think very highly of the Spartans. All you might have to do is emancipate them, offer them some gold. Perhaps they'll leave. It's a very, the relationship between Spartan and Helot is a very, very complicated one. I think it's very easy to sort of impose our modern thoughts of slavery and master and slave onto things, but things were very heavily nuanced there. I'm of no doubt that the Helots were certainly subjugated and in most cruel ways sometimes, but the Laconian Helots, they were separated. There was the Messenian and the Laconian. The Laconian Helots, almost never revolted. They were basically forced into freedom by trying to think by the citizens of Megalopolis, or the Thebans after Leuctra, and a lot of them remained, Helot slaves for another 150 years after that, before the Romans, basically killed the practice of the Spartans keeping Helots. So it's a very complex relationship, and that number of Helots there at the field of Plataea, that's a very strange one. I'm not sure. What's your read on that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard. Again, it goes back to the information that we have. It's very difficult to say for any certainty what was happening in Sparta and I guess their politics of the time, because even around Plataea, there was a lot of delaying of even sending forces north, and there was a fleet waiting off the coast that were waiting for I think Athenian ships, and it's all a very confusing time of what was actually taking place. But yeah, so what was even happening in Sparta is, who knows? But this is, and like you were saying, it's different points of history. So obviously we look at like a Helot revolt and we go, well, obviously the conditions were terrible and they've decided to break out and revolt. For example, around the Spartan earthquake. But this is, you're talking like almost a generation and a half earlier. Who knows what the conditions were like at that stage, and were there, I don't know, was there more contentness amongst the Helots at that stage, because from my understanding is it was quite different slavery than, say, the Athenian. Obviously, the Athenians didn't keep the Greeks as slaves, but their slavery was quite different, where it seemed the Helots actually lived in their own communities and farmed land, and obviously Spartans would have been present in those areas, but it's not like the Spartan homeland, I guess. And I guess you had a lot of what's the other class called?
Periodically.
Yeah. From what I understand, a lot of those lived in those areas as well, and perhaps forming some part of society. So what are all the interactions of these? Does it lead to, they are subjugated, but does it lead to this is the life I know. It's, by everything else that I know around me, it's not that bad because of the conditions I live in. But then later on, do things get worse? So I guess it's what happens as a product of the actual time that they're living in. And we just don't know, I guess, a lot of those details of what may have tipped them over the edge, or may have allowed them to have some sort of, I guess, contentness with what was happening. But I don't know how I don't know if it would have been too much convincing them to go, but to Plataea, but more of a you're going type thing. And my assumption would be that they would be selecting all the able-bodied males that would be the ones that would be most feared if a revolt was going to break out in Sparta anyway.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair read of it, and there's just go back to it a second. There's also that another dichotomy is, obviously, I mentioned it briefly, the Messenian and the Laconian Helots. I've always thought that the Messenian Helots were very much akin to, for lack of a better analogy, almost the slaves of cotton growers in the South during the early parts of America, where they were like a landed estate. The slaves would work the field, obviously, and produce the grain and things like that, and they'd be overseen by Spartan overlords or quite likely their perioikoi employees. Whereas in Laconia, I think things were a little bit different to that. I mean, obviously, the Spartans, after they sort of synomicized with Amyclae and became, a loose sort of Spartan city, from there on in, there was no other cities that were brought within the fold, and a lot of those sort of more powerful villages were around the place that could come to terms with the Spartans rather than fight, joined in the alliance, the early proto sort of Spartan alliance prior to the Peloponnesian League, and they became the perioikoi, the cities that for lack of a better description, couldn't come to terms with the Spartans, or wouldn't come to terms, I think, were attacked by the combined forces of the Spartans and the perioikoi, and were brought into some sort of bondage. But I think if we could go back to see the conditions of both the Laconian and the Messenian Helots, that there would have been a severe amount of disparity in there. And I think, just guessing, that the Laconian Helots would have seen themselves as superior to the Messenian Helots, and I'd vouch that the majority of the Helots that we saw at Plataea were Laconian Helots, or if not, as you said, fit able-bodied male Helots from the Messenian side. But then that remainder of the Spartan force, and quite likely quite a lot of the perioikoi, were there to keep the rest as hostage, effectively. Like, if you don't come back, if you don't serve us well on campaign, your wives, your children, your lands, your belongings won't be there when you return. That would be the only thing that I could think of that would have kept them in line for such a large force, as opposed to the homoioi that were there from the Spartans.
Yeah, because there's even the thought that a year earlier at Thermopylae that Helots were maybe present with 300 Spartans.
Absolutely.
That went across as well.
Yeah,
I don't think it was it? I think the figure was it 3 to 1 or something like that? They were. I can't remember the actual figure that.
Yeah, it's a tougher one. I mean, it's sort of, it was the force that Sparta took to Thermopylae was obviously the 300. Sparta always had a guard of 300 around the king. They were called the Ippies, or knights, which is an interesting term considering we just discussed how there wasn't a lot of cavalry used in ancient Greece, particularly at that time. They still had that term of knight, which sort of was a descendant from more Mycenaean times, I'm thinking. But yeah, I think it was only maybe 3-1. I think that of the helots went, and those helots would have been the most trusted helots as well. They wouldn't like the body servants, the men servants of those Spartan nobles that ended up trekking off to Thermopylae.
Yeah, actually, you brought up the Hippias, the 300 bodyguard. I mean, I just covered this in a Patreon episode actually when we just did recently, and they were, I guess, the 300 they go, the movie 300 and whatever else. But from what I understand, it was meant to be 3 separate companies of 100 men each. And
Correct.
So they were meant to be bodyguards for the kings. So I would assume you would have them split between the 2 kings, or what's your read on all 300 of them being sent out with one king?
Well, that had changed. Obviously, you probably remember when Cleomenes invaded Attica in the late 500s, and Demaratus was there too. And he was seeding the ground underneath Cleomenes. They obviously had a pretty serious dispute going back to the succession of Demaratus, which was largely called illegitimate by Cleomenes. And because of the help that he'd sort of given the enemies of the Spartans. And that expedition was an utter embarrassment for Cleomenes. He fell from grace from Spartan politics. It wasn't until the late 490s that he started becoming ascendant, not long before he went off the deep end and decided to, I don't know which source you decide to believe, drink too much alcohol and kill himself, or assassinated by the ephoric. Either way, the ruling was made. Yeah, it's a good story either way. The ruling was made at that time that only one king would ever go on campaign again, but would be in general accompanied by 2 ephors. But there weren't 2 ephors that I know of anyway at the Battle of Thermopylae. So it's a very interesting thing. And obviously the 300 that you mentioned, the Hippias, that was sort of the final stages of the Agoge. These were the champions that were sort of selected by the 3 sort of I think they were called Habontes, I think. They chose 100 men each to become the sort of the personal bodyguard, but they were all replaced by adult Spartan men who had children, because and nothing tells you more certainly than that fact alone that was a suicide mission. That those 301 Spartans, including Leonidas, were going to die. The fact that they chose all Spartan that already had sons that could inherit the plots of land, the kleros. So I don't know about the 300 itself and how that fits into the dynamics of the 2 king system.
Yeah, so it seems likely, I guess, 300 went. That's all the sources seem to agree on that. But it being the Hippias, maybe not, because as we know, the Hippias was young adult men that made up these companies. So, and like you said, they've been replaced with men that have already had sons, so they had their family lines to live on. But it's interesting how it just fits into that, I guess, that same the idea of the Hippias. But yeah, I guess there seems to be a departure there. Something's a bit different for this battle, and the reason for Sparta to send it out. Because I mean, they obviously only sent 300, so something tells you that there's not the idea of a full-fledged battle going on. There's another idea present here.
Yeah, it's really tough to get around. I mean, I think for sure that they were going to die. Obviously, we saw the compliment that they broke out when the whole Peloponnesian League gets behind it. That can be that's a one hell of a force that the Spartans could bring to bear. Why they didn't send more to Thermopylae? What else was going on? Was there a party for war and a party for appeasement within Sparta? And this was Leonidas's way of trying to spur the party for war into action and then quiet the party for peace. It's very hard. We get so little from the sources, but I think the bare fact that they went there to die and they did their duty in that regard, that tells me that there's probably a little bit more going on there. Like Sparta was very, very proud of its kings, and certainly wouldn't go throwing one off to die in battle, along with they always had a shortage of manpower as well. 300 noble Spartans, being dead on a battlefield, that wasn't ideal for anybody. So it was, there was definitely an element within Sparta that it's hard to sort of transpose, how we think now into the past. But I think they were aware, or at the very least, Leonidas was aware of the momentousness of that occasion, and he certainly rose to it.
Yeah, it's one of those ones where you're not sure, is it presented as such this noble sacrifice idea because of what actually took place and be able to look into hindsight, writing history later, or did they know full well what was going on? It's one of those, it's a bit tricky to really tease out. But the other interesting thing is, because obviously you've got Thermopylae going on, and at the same time you've got Artemisium. And the more and more I read into Artemisium, the more and more I started thinking, I feel like this battle, or this, the effort at Artemisium seems almost like the main effort. And it was going to supposedly block the entire fleet from coming around and would prevent them from being able to land in the Spartan rear. Because I think it was like 40 miles sort of northeast of Thermopylae, and was blocking the straits that come down Euboea. And but yeah, I found the more and more I read about that, it was almost like this seemed to be, I don't know, the main effort in a sort of sense. I don't know if you've got how far you've I know because you've done up to marathons. I'm not sure how far you've sort of read into these areas and your thoughts on it.
Oh, look, once again, it's Artemisium being primarily an affair of the Athens. It's never really been on my radar too much, but I would say that I put whether or not deciding whether the silver went for the mines, was it to go as a pension for Athenian citizens, or was it to build a navy or whatever? I don't know, but Herodotus certainly paints it that way. And as far as having the foresight to sail to Artemisium to be able to support what was going on the land at the same time, I think there's some credence to that. I think Themistocles was certainly a visionary. He was an amazing man. He was one of those great men, like Miltiades, that fell from grace rather quick, but was absolutely pivotal to the campaign. So, look, I wouldn't put it past Themistocles that he was there, on purpose to try and support the Spartans. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the two engagements happened, if not at the same time, at almost exactly the same time. Is that right?
Yeah, supposedly they're meant to be happening over the same 3 days.
Right.
And and I think it was part of obviously, before this took place, you had the meetings where the Hellenic League was formed, or what we call the Hellenic League. They didn't really have a name for it, but and it was supposedly coming up with this united idea of defending Greece. And so there was like an aborted attempt up at the Tempe Pass, and they fell back. And it's very difficult to know what was actually happening. It just seemed like that initial meeting and decision was very disjointed, and then all of a sudden it seems like now we've got a coherent strategy and we're going to follow through, and that's where the Thermopylae and Artemisium take place, which it seems like a much more organized venture, because you've got so many different, you've got the 31 different city-states all combining and meeting up at these areas to help out. Because, as I'm sure you'd like, at Thermopylae, we didn't just have 300 Spartans, did we?
No.
We had, I think it was
of course not.
Something like just over 7,000 Greeks were present there or something.
Yeah, and your favourite Thebans were there once again, which is an interesting, ties in nicely to your thoughts about them, not being entirely Medized by the stage of the Greco-Persian Wars. They seem to be there, rather willingly. I mean, Thebes isn't so far from the hot gates as well. I mean, you had Phocians that were there, Plataeans were there as well. There's an assortment of Helots, obviously. I think 7,000 to 8,000 would be about the right number.
Yeah, I think it's somewhere between there.
Yeah, but obviously it was only the Spartans that stayed. The mighty King Leonidas told them to go home and tend to their hearths and stay there to fight the final battle, I suppose. But no, of course it wasn't just the 300. And regardless of how wide that pass actually was back in the day, they say between 30 to 40 meters wide, 300 Spartans would not have been enough to hold out.
I think
unless you had Frank Miller as the general.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, was it another 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans that supposedly stayed once they sent everyone away.
Yeah, that's right.
What are your thoughts on the Thebans? Because I can't remember if we spoke about this on air or before we started talking.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I really admire Thebes. I enjoy like the history from Thebes. And they weren't an easy spot, to be fair. I mean, they cop a lot of flack for Medizing, but like you just mentioned, there was only 31 cities that didn't, and they were all really beneath the Persian arc of march in that final campaign. So you can't blame the Thessalians, you can't blame the Macedonians for Medizing. I mean, nobody was up there trying to save them. I mean, even the Spartans, if they had their way, probably would have made their final stand at the Isthmus of Corinth, if it wasn't for Athens threatening to.
There's many times
nick off with. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I've got a lot of sympathy for them, and it's hard because obviously the natural extension of my show will come to a point where Thebes will utterly crush Sparta on the battlefield, but Epaminondas was an absolute genius of a general. The way that he constructed his army and organized the society of the Thebans was magical. From Bronze Age history, it was the place of legend. A vast majority of Athenian tragedy took place in Thebes or in and around Thebes with its ruling dynasty, and the missing epic cycle. I think you might be aware of the Theban epic cycle that we get little bits of tidbits here and there was solely about, was it 7 against Thebes? Is that the
7 against
story?
Thebes? Yeah.
7 against Thebes, yes. I mean, Thebes is fascinating. It's one of those places. It's just on the periphery of what we know. 90% of what we know about ancient Greece comes from Athens. The other 10% sort of comes from, or maybe 8% comes from Sparta. Then there's maybe 1% Corinth, 1% Thebes, and a little bit of smattering of everybody else. But there's so much there that we just don't know. But I'm personally a big fan.
Yeah, it's they're a victim of their geography, aren't they? Because of where they're situated.
100%.
And the same thing you saw with Thessaly. I mean, that's the first, I guess, northern Greek region that was invaded by Persia, and they attempted to seek help from the Hellenic League, and that's the whole reason they went to Tempe Pass in the first place, was to try and help Thessaly. But then they discovered that the position was hopeless, and they had to leave. And Thessaly goes, well, we've only got one option. If we want to, live in our cities and keep our lands, we have to Medize.
Yeah, and easier to give earth and water and then die.
Yeah. So. And I think the same idea came out with Thebes. But again, I think it's a product of the times of history. A lot of what's written about the Greek and Persian Wars was being written about around the time of the Peloponnesian War breaking out, and Thebes was not very popular with Athens at that time.
You can say that again. Yeah. How do you reconcile? Because Herodotus' narrative is pretty clear that basically from the trial of Miltiades, from there on in, it's basically Themistocles, spurring on the Athenians towards, making the wooden wall, getting all the ships ready, building the triremes. But from my understanding, the mine, is it Lauranium or
Laurian mines? Yeah.
Laurian mines weren't discovered or opened until I think 483, barely a couple of years before.
Yeah.
Thermopylae. So what happened in that 7 years from Marathon to there? Was Athens just twiddling its thumbs, or what was going on there?
So that's the time you had Miltiades that after their victories went out, and I can't remember if it was Thassos, the island that he went to. And
Paros,
sorry. And where he had his downfall, and it was seen to have, like most generals, they get tried for corruption and taking money and whatnot, and he ended up dying of wounds that he received while he was there. But Themistocles comes along, but the thing is, he doesn't. So I think Laurian was 84 or something like that, and he didn't initially present the mines as here's our way we're going to defend against the Persians. Initially, when he tried to get and he was having, obviously there were different factions within Athens at the time. We had Aristides as well,
yeah.
and Pericles' father. Drawing a blank now.
Yeah, I've lost his name too.
And
that guy.
He had them both basically, they were his competitors, and he had them ostracized during those periods. So there was a lot of, I think, competing with different factions during that stage as well. And But he didn't use the threat of the Persians as his policy for how to spend that money, because obviously Aristides was basically supposedly meant to parcel it out in even quantities to all the citizens, where then Themistocles argued that we should use it to build a fleet to protect Athens. But it wasn't against Persia that he initially argued it for. It was against the island of Aegina, which was near Salamis. And because they had just risen at the end of that Archaic period as quite a competitor to Athens around the trade routes, because they had quite a powerful navy as well. And so they were seen as, I guess, quite an immediate threat at that stage. And so this was what they used as the argument to get this policy forward, using a more, I guess, clear and present danger to Athens at that time, whereas Persia was more of they attacked us, but we don't really see any Persians around here.
So it was I mean, the Hellenic League formed, was it 482? Like it was a year, wasn't it, really, before?
And this is all confusing too. Yeah, it's like 82, but then it talks about meetings, but it doesn't seem like any sort of coherent league group was formed until perhaps like maybe a year before Xerxes invaded, or 6 months. Like it's hard to tell. And that's where we start seeing a lot of the momentum taking place, and what leads to Thermopylae and Artemisium. Because I think they even tried to employ other allies as well. They tried to get Syracuse, and I think Argos. They approached Argos to help out as well. But it's and then you also got the story of they arranged to send spies over into Persia. And this was when the Persian forces were amassing around Sardis, and they sent the spies over to, see what was going on, and they were picked up almost straight away. And instead of being executed, supposedly Xerxes is meant to have allowed them to look around the camp so they could report back on the numbers to the Greeks of what was basically going to come down on them. And I think this is maybe a big part in why we get such inflated numbers too, to some degree in the sources as well. It's perhaps maybe some of these, maybe there's a miscalculation, but then also perhaps part of that as well was Xerxes was overinflating his own power to these people. And this is because obviously when the spies returned, there would have been reports made, and one would feel that historians working from that time may have had access to these reports and went off of these inflated figures too. Yeah,
makes sense. I mean, even Herodotus' narrative, basically with the march of Xerxes' force, he separates rivers into ones that were either completely drunk dry by the invading army or weren't. So, and they obviously dug a channel, across the Athos Peninsula. That's no small feat. It was obviously not 1.5 million, 2 million soldiers, but I think it would be pretty safe to assume that the forces arrayed against the Greeks were like nothing the world had seen up until that point. And I mean, you've probably seen yourself when you look at large groups of people, it could be 10,000, could be 100,000. Like, you really have no way of even grasping what those sort of numbers look like. So I mean, it probably would have been a bit of both. A bit of that the dreaded Mede coming from the east. We've seen the size of these forces. Like their arrows will block out the sun. This sort of rhetoric. Along with probably more people than the average Greek had ever seen up until that point.
Yeah, and I think it's a combination of things, perhaps with the numbers. Obviously, you give a really large number, and you're just saying there's a lot of people. And by just even today, when you talk about large things, you rattle off some large number, and people don't expect that to be true. They just assume that you're talking about something really large. But even I think there's talk about the Persian commanders too that were commanding the different forces. It's thought Herodotus maybe confused the names of some of those because some were pretty close, and so it's thought that maybe that's what's then allowed like a 10-fold increase in the numbers, where perhaps maybe it was more like 250,000, but then even that seems a little large too, and that's probably maybe where we see overinflated numbers from these spies that may have reported back information. Obviously, because the information was provided to them by the enemy. So maybe that's why we're seeing larger numbers. But
yeah.
yeah, it's all. I think it's all part of a puzzle that leads to why we might be getting these large numbers. I think I spoke about that back when I spoke about Thermopylae as well, just those different elements. And I remember talking to Trevor Cully about that as well. He does the Persian History Podcast. I think you've spoken to him as well, haven't you, on one of your shows?
Yeah. Really good.
Yeah. He's definitely a wealth of knowledge. What did you guys actually speak about in your show?
We actually just spoke about the Persian Empire and I guess the rise of Darius. I wanted to sort of, start with Cyrus and Cambyses and sort of, really put the Persians on the scene because they'd been a non-entity in the podcast up until that point. So it was really just an episode of just introducing the Persians, bringing them up to date of the Battle of Marathon, really. So we didn't get into Xerxes at all, but it was, how the Persians sort of flipped the paradigm on the Medes, the 560s, 550s, through Cyrus's campaigns and then Cambyses and then into Darius. Yeah, that man's fantastic. You could just basically wind him up and let him go. He's just an absolute fountain of wisdom.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What did you talk to Trevor about?
Yeah, so the episode I did with Trevor, that's going back a bit now. It was more, actually I did that, it was at the end of the period of the Greek and Persian Wars. And I wanted to get, I guess, the Persian perspective of that entire war, what was taking place. And that's where we discussed a lot of things around perhaps like to do with Marathon. What was the real intentions there? And, was it a full out invasion to try and subjugate all of Greece? And it seemed maybe not, just given the numbers as well. Like it just seemed like such the force didn't seem large enough to be able to achieve what they knew to achieve. And just given the pattern that they were forming as they were leading to Marathon as well, it seemed more like an extension of the Ionian Revolt, where they were bringing all the different areas back into control, and obviously Naxos and all that sort of stuff as well. And since Eritrea was also involved and Athens was involved, because they were the two sort of Greek mainland areas that sent forces, they had to be punished. And there was even talks that supposedly Athens had offered earth and water to Persia previously. And so did they already see Athens as some sort of subjected people? I'm not so sure on that idea, since even from that date there was no connection to the Persian Empire with any sort of tribute from that to that time as well. So, but yeah,
this is in 506, right? Is that we were talking about? Is that
So
the Spartan invasion of Athens in 506?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I was trying to seek an alliance against Sparta, and supposedly the delegates that were sent off mistakenly agreed to an alliance, not knowing what the whole symbology behind earth and water actually meant. Like, yeah, sure, we'll give you some dirt and some water.
Yeah, we've got plenty of it. I think I covered that with Trevor too. I said that sounded very strange from the Spartan perspective, that with an army coming from the Peloponnese, not far, that they would send to Persia for help. Like, it doesn't even stand to reason that A, the Persians could even help them, or B, arrive in time. So it never really made a lot of sense to me, that one.
Yeah, so it was basically looking at a lot of those ideas, and helped me sort of also form those ideas about how perhaps this was part of the larger picture, where it wasn't the initial campaign wasn't one of total domination, but it was basically about, almost like inch by inch, the Persians would move into areas, establish themselves, then from there they could then move further into new areas and subjugate other areas. And so it was kind of just like a slow rolling process.
Did he get into, or did you ask him about how the defeat at Marathon was perceived within Persia?
So pretty much just a blip. Like, it wouldn't have been, obviously, and this isn't a takeaway, obviously for Athens, it was a major event. And I think it really cemented their confidence in themselves as a military power going forward. But for Persia, at the end of the day, they sent 25, say at best, they sent 25,000 troops. They sailed there. We know that a great proportion of them left on their ships to try and sail around to Athens. Obviously, the story is they made it back to Athens to defend it. Before the Persians could land, the Persians saw them there and sailed home. So it would appear that, in the grand scheme of things, not a great deal of, the Persians had a massive pool of manpower, and what was lost in Greece was almost nothing. And probably, the west of the empire was the fringes. When you go further east in Persia, and that's where you start getting the main power centers, and perhaps even the larger campaigns are taking place further away from the west. So the losses that took place, I mean, not many people would know about it apart from those that were present.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, you so often you look at these things from the Greek side of view, and I've had trouble it's one of those things that's always struck me as it's just so unlikely that, given the respective arcs of, we'll say, the main players of the whole campaign, obviously the Persians, the Spartans and the Athenians, the Persians were doing their thing. Obviously, they had some rapid expansion over the past sort of 70 or 80 years, and, were an ascendant empire, probably the most powerful empire that particular part of the world had ever seen, especially the Mediterranean area. But for Sparta and Athens to come from, what is relative obscurity, through the 8th, 7th and the 6th centuries, they have their own little bits of legend here and there, obviously, Lycurgus and, Solon and Draco. And, there's a story starting to form, and they had a, pretty steeped, archaic past as well, in the Bronze Age, but that they came to these 2 points where they both became the exact pieces the Greek puzzle needed, to defeat the Persians. The Spartans had a ready-made land army with the backings of a massive alliance of Peloponnesian cities that they'd pieced together over the previous 50 years. And the Athenians had emerged out of tyranny into a nascent democracy, and within 30 years had, the most powerful independent army the Mediterranean ever seen, and that they could combine in such a way that they could defeat the Persians. It's just such an unlikely event, and one that I've never really properly been able to reconcile within my mind how, it makes me believe in fate, in destiny, that Sparta and Athens together were destined to defeat the Persians.
Yes, it does seem like such an unlikely story, and when you actually go through it too, you just, my mind boggles of why the alliance didn't fall apart. There were so many instances where you could have just seen the whole thing break apart, because it seemed Sparta and the Peloponnesians at key points were hell-bent on making the Isthmus at Corinth the defensive line.
Yep.
Obviously now you did that, Athens is gone. And I guess one key element that, there's stories around Themistocles, right, at Salamis, which is supposedly a key part in why the alliance held at that juncture, and I guess it's kind of like a turning point in the war. But and a lot of it revolves around the navy as well. So Sparta and the Peloponnesians could fall back into the Peloponnese, and they can defend the land route, but there's quite a large Persian navy as well. What's to stop them landing a large land force into the Peloponnese elsewhere? Once you've got a navy, it's not just the Corinthian Isthmus that's going to be the point that needs to be defended.
Oh, they could just land anywhere within the Peloponnese with impunity, and absolutely upset the apple cart when it comes to the Peloponnesian land-based army. No, the two places they might not have acted like it some 60 or 70 years later, but at that period of history they needed each other. If there was no Spartans, there was certainly no victory at Plataea. That is for sure. And if there was no Athens, there was no victory at Salamis, and no overall victory either. It's tough to say who should receive the lion's share of the blame, but I think without either of those two elements, the Greek defense would have been absolutely nothing. And history today would be far different to the way that we currently know it now.
And I think it's something we touched on last time we spoke ages ago about who was most responsible for the victory during the Greek and Persian Wars. But after you've really read through it and understood what's going on, it's not really a question anymore, is it? Because all the dynamics came together to be able to defend, and one without the other was, I think, Greece was going to fall. So
absolutely, yep, absolutely.
And then it does. I still wonder about a lot of the stories in Herodotus about the alliance falling apart, like especially on at Salamis, on the eve of Salamis. There's a couple of points where it just looks like, we're sailing, we're going back to the Peloponnese.
Oh,
and
for sure, yeah.
The story about Themistocles, basically going off and telling Xerxes that you've got the Greeks trapped. If you come in and sail into the straits now, they won't be able to get away. And supposedly this was the ploy to then force the Greeks having to fight a battle there, because he supposedly thought all hope was lost in actually keeping the Peloponnesians at Salamis. But I think even at one stage, because obviously Athens had fallen by this stage as well, Persia had marched in, and the Athenians had fallen back to the island of Salamis as taken refuge there. And this is where the rest of the fleet came to as well. But it's sorry, I lost where I was going then.
You'll pick it up.
Sorry. And so at one point, they've got no home anymore, and this is the whole argument. This is supposedly Corinth came in and was saying, what are you? Athens, you've lost your city. You've got no power anymore. And this is where the whole, I guess, it's sort of like a motivational thing. You kind of think it's in there because Herodotus is talking to the Athenians about how Athens is more than its city. Its people are the polis. And then there was talk of them basically saying, well, we'll sail to and create a new colony in Italy and leave you be. And supposedly that was one of the points where everyone decided to then turn around and, oh no, we'll stay now. But it's this back and forward of this not knowing if the battle was going to be fought at Salamis.
Yeah, I mean, those little stories that Herodotus chucks in, it's colour, but I think it's just a way of trying to explain just how unlikely it all was. Like Salamis was just the most unlikely victory, when it comes to, a relatively untested Athenian navy against, the might of Persia. I mean, they had a little bit of skirmishing around Artemisia, but it was mainly a holding action for the most part. It was the first great naval battle in the Mediterranean, and the story of Themistocles going off and conversing with Xerxes, that just doesn't, that just wouldn't have occurred. I couldn't see that happening historically. But I think it's just the way of even Herodotus with the sources that he had and the accounts that he had. He's like, how do I reconcile this? How do I reconcile that the Persians went there and lost such a they snatched a defeat from the jaws of victory basically? And I just think the unlikeliness of the whole event wasn't lost on Herodotus. Now, Herodotus was a very pious individual. There wasn't a thing that occurred that wasn't by the will of the gods, or wasn't in tribute to them. So, you're always going to get those sort of slightly spiritual elements in his history, and Thucydides to a lesser extent later on. But I think just a lot of those little anecdotes that he throws in there, it's just a way of trying to explain that what appeared just so incredibly unlikely. It's always amazed me. It really has.
Another thing I've found, which I think perhaps leads into the thinking of maybe this is just some, dumb luck in some way, is I don't think Herodotus was very strategically minded. Because, I mean, you see this presented a lot, like, I don't know, I've seen articles written about how, the Greeks in their warfare weren't really strategically minded and, just had, I guess, battlefield tactics, weren't really thinking of the big picture. But I think the battles and how they unfolded and different things, with Thermopylae set up as it was, with Artemisium set off onto the flank, I think there was much more going on. But I think the whole perception of why, it's reported the Greeks didn't have strategic thought is because the historians have reported didn't have strategic thought. So it just doesn't come through in the writing. And so I think a lot of it's lost within the sources. And I guess too, if you're not exposed to strategic thinking or whatever else, it's hard to maybe pick it up unless you really start digging deeper.
Yeah, that's a pretty good point. I mean, you've served in the military, so you probably have a little bit more bit of personal thought around those sorts of things. But yeah, I mean, it's probably the right word is for opaque when it comes to Herodotus's understanding of military endeavors. You know, like he's more concerned with the machinations of the heavens and the stars than he is with, you know, the actual battlefield tactics. And, you know, I think probably when it comes to land-based conflicts, probably Thermopylae is the one that he dwells on the most. And, you know, you do get a little bit of a sense for, I guess, how disciplined the Spartans were. You know, he mentions, you know, controlled retreats, and things like that. So, you know, on the micro scale, yeah, for sure. But, you know, you get nothing out of Plataea. You really don't, you know, like you get 10 or 11 days of back and forwards and looking for good omens and, you know, what seems to be a conflict that's relatively over in, you know, as little as 10 minutes, probably, you know, like it really is the biggest engagement you're ever going to come across. Yeah, no, I think you're right about Herodotus there for sure.
And I think a lot of that sort of strategic thought is lost at Plataea as well, where, I mean, it just seems like some of the movements are for a reason, but just the way that it's presented, you just like, it seems like there is no reason. But I just can't imagine that commanders would be, doing as what Herodotus suggested. I think definitely there's much more going on.
Yeah, it's a tough one too. When you think about, like, you know, your average commander, you know, take, you know, Miltiades or Callimachus, people like that, you know, they're obviously, you know, they perhaps drilled with their entire city militia at some stage, but Plataea, that's a different kettle of fish. You know, you're talking 60, 70,000 hoplites. You know, like there wouldn't be a commander in Greece at that period of time who'd had any experience in controlling or commanding or strategizing for a force so large. And, you know, maybe they just went macro with what they were doing before. Like, you know, this is how we normally fight. We put the Spartans on this side, we put everybody else on that side, and we have a crack at it. But yeah, it really does seem that there's some detail lacking, and to win such a stunning victory with so little detail, it's tantalizing to, you know, start trying to pick it apart and try to understand, you know, what really was in the minds of the Greeks and the Persians at that time.
I definitely think Plataea was definitely a lesson in commander control for both armies. Such a, you know, large mass of troops with, you know, many different contingents formed up. You know, it would have been a nightmare trying to get messages across the battlefield and trying to operate in any sort of, you know, coordinated effort. I mean, and that's what happens at Plataea as well, where supposedly the Spartans get caught short in the field with supposedly a night withdrawal that was meant to take place that didn't happen until the sun started rising. And yeah, there's all these sorts of I think command and control was definitely you know, something that a lot of commanders learnt very soon after that.
Yeah, like, you know, you almost get the picture that it's this, you know, it's this massed charge of, you know, 60,000 hoplites, but you can see at the, you know, the start of the Battle of Marathon in the sources that, you know, the initial advance towards the Persians was really just a pell-mell charge, you know, and they'd obviously designated a point, or they had, you know, some runner that was, you know, placing a spear in the ground and says, you know, this is where we stop, this is where we form up, you know. So there must have been something similar to that at Plataea as well. It couldn't have just been like, you know, a charge across the field and hitting the enemy as, you know, a disconcerted mass of troops. You know, it would have to been a concerted rank. That's where the true strength of the phalanx actually was. So, you know, we can only guess, but you would hope that, you know, whatever Pausanias had in mind, that was something similar to the mindset of Miltiades, and they, you know, they made a charge and to get, you know, maybe underneath the range of the arrows, so to speak, and then line up and then, you know, meet the Persians with their full brunt of force, because that would stand to reason. You know, the battle perhaps lasted as long as 10 or 15 minutes, you know, with tens of thousands of casualties on the Persian side. So there must have been some strategy in there involved, but you get none of it out of the sources. Like, Plataea is almost an afterthought in Herodotus' narrative.
And that's the interesting thing. Like with Marathon, you're talking about around 10,000, you know, hoplites on the field, and at Plataea, that was one contingent. That was like the Athenian contingent, and then you still had all the other all the other contingents on the battlefield as well. And this is where, command and control just would have been a nightmare trying to get messages across, especially as well when you had the Persian cavalry just roaming sort of freely around the whole area as well.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, the Athenians at that time, you know, because of Marathon, were probably the most experienced Greeks when it came to that particular type of warfare. I mean, you know, surely the Spartans probably individually were probably better trained, but the Athenians were the only ones that had experienced that kind of conflict. You know, I mean, 10,000 Greeks versus 25,000 Persians at Marathon. There was never a conflict like that. You know, I mean, unless you go back to the the Lelantine War, which is probably largely legendary anyway. None of the Greeks, aside from the Athenians, probably had experience in that type of warfare. It would have been,
And ironically, too, the Athenians didn't fight any Persians at Plataea either. It was all the Greek allies that they came up against. It was the Spartans that fought the Persians.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, the Athenians also had experience there too, because a lot of the Persians at Marathon were made up by Greek components as well. So, good old Athenians, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, you've obviously taken the narrative past Plataea, which is likely where I'll end it. How pivotal do you? I mean, how do you put Mycale? How do you put that into, or Mycale, however you want to say it? How do you put that into the sort of overall picture of the Greco-Persian Wars?
So it definitely seems like a turning point in the whole. It supposedly marks, I guess, an end to the hostilities of the Persian. Like, it's funny, you can say the Greek and Persian Wars, but the Greek and Persian Wars can technically go on past this as well. But because of the conflicts that go on and Persian involvement behind the scenes in Greek affairs. But it's a point where I guess you could say it marks a turning point in the Persian invasion. The Persian invasion is basically stopped on the mainland at Plataea and defeated. And Mycale seems to be the Greeks have now taken the fight into Persian territory. And obviously they defeated and routed the Persian army there. It was, supposedly meant to be a naval battle that turned into a land battle. And that's where I guess it was the main force that was supposedly around Sardis also came to help and was defeated as well. So the strongest, I guess there was no other Persian forces nearby to come to respond, which allowed the Athenians to then sail up to the Hellespont, and they were going to supposedly dismantle the Xerxes bridges that were already taken down. And this is the point where Sparta sails home. And this is also a point where it marks, I guess, a turning point in the alliance between the two. It seems like the Hellenic League was held together because of a common enemy. Sparta and Athens had different interests. They'd always had different interests. They had different forms of government, different systems of society. And we'd seen before that they were in conflict beforehand.
Absolutely, yeah.
But this is the point where the Greco-Persian Wars saw Athens rise quite significantly in wealth and power as well, because of their navy was one big part. And it's at this point that you see as this turning point in, hey, we no longer have this common enemy to the same degree we used to, because Greece is free from them, but we still do have a Persian threat. But for Athens, that Persian threat was further away now, and it was a threat to their trade lines, trade routes going through the Black Sea, and they had a lot of connections with the Ionian Greeks as well. So now they had a much bigger connection to a lot of these areas. But Sparta, obviously, didn't really care as much about these issues and didn't want to really have in service a bunch of troops, this far away from Laconia, and wanted to return home. Now, there's like an instance where they come back to try and take control, but at the end of the day, this is what leads to the Hellenic League still stays in place by name or by some sort of agreement. We call it the Hellenic League now, but you then see the Delian League formed, and this is where Athens basically forms up with a lot of the Ionian Greeks and Eastern Greeks, because they were originally incorporated into the Hellenic League during this period, but there was a lot of arguments over who was going to lead it. Athens ended up leading it for the first time during one of these periods, and in the end, a lot of these islands and cities backed Athens to take command, and in the end, they formed their own league, and it was to basically fulfill a lot of those interests that they all had, whereas Sparta didn't have the same interests. So it seems like this is a point where the Hellenic League is still in existence, but now we have this new league, the Delian League, which looks after these interests in the Eastern Aegean, and Sparta then starts reverting more back to its Peloponnesian League as its number one priority.
Fortress Peloponnese. Yeah, that's. I mean, it's there's that anecdotal story where I think what's his name, Aristagoras comes over to Sparta and shows them that map of Persia, and he's saying, I think his plan is to sort of more or less say that, see, all you've got to do is take this area, then take this area, and before you know it, like dominoes, you'll collapse all of the Persian Empire right back to Susa. And the Spartan, I think it was Cleomenes, said, like, how far is it from Ionia to Persia? And Aristagoras is something like, it's 90 days march, and the Spartans just laugh him out of it. It's like, there's no way in the world, we are sending troops that far. And I think, when the tyrant of Miletus, what's his name? Croesus, wasn't it? Yeah, he sends, King Croesus, he sends the Lydian king. He sends towards the Spartans for help against the invading Persians army, and all they can muster up at that stage is I think one ship and a nasty letter. Yeah. For the Persian king. Yeah, so you're very lucky to get the Spartans that far out of the Peloponnese.
Yeah, yeah, it's
very lucky indeed.
Yeah, but I guess it's a point that marks this turning point, and it's a point where suspicions and all that sort of stuff start building. There's a lot of dynamics going on with the factions in Athens and the factions in Sparta. Because, I mean, you have these, what historians now call like the peace party and war party in Sparta. Yep. And again, we don't know what's going on in Sparta, but just because of how events unfold, you look back and think, oh, it seems perhaps maybe the peace party has more of an influence on what's going on at the moment. And which also lines up with Cimon, who's in Athens, who has a good relationship with the Spartans. So you see a lot of these dynamics that play out. It's not so much told to in the sources, but it's you can kind of infer maybe what was likely taking place internally in those times.
I think like obviously peace party, war party, but there was definitely led primarily by Cimon, a pro-Spartan party within Athens. And you see that with the earthquake that occurs in Sparta, and Cimon leads a force. It is Cimon, isn't it, who leads a force of Athenians to assist in quelling the revolt.
And that was his downfall.
That was his downfall, and it was also probably the end of good Spartan and Athenian relations, as they were anyway. The Athenians were obviously disgusted that
that was sent home.
The Spartans. Yeah.
Which is a curious,
I think there's
another curious event too, which is difficult to tease out what was really taking place there.
Yeah, I mean, from the Spartan side, you get like the element that perhaps the Athenians who are democratic, obviously believed in the representation by Greek people, saw the Helots enslaved in the flesh, and started whispering to them, by the way, you could be free from these guys. And I think there was a bit of antagonism going in around that, and the Spartans were like, we're not having you guys here. You're supposed to help us re-enslave these guys, not talk to them about freedom and things like that. And the Athenians were sent home, and Cimon was disgraced after that, which is that's really the last time Spartan and Athenians really have anything to do with each other for the rest of history in a positive light.
Yes. Yeah, it's and it leads down the road to, I guess, what ends up happening is the Peloponnesian War, and that's where I'm basically heading at the moment when I start picking back up my narrative in the series. I just finished up with the First Peloponnesian War, so that was the more minor conflict that broke out between the two. And it's interesting when you read about it, it doesn't even come across as a war. Like you're reading through the sources, and then you're just like, oh, hang on a sec, I think we're in the middle of a war now. And it's not, it's like a few years in before even Sparta and Athens are fighting one another. But so it's an interesting point anyway. And I think like we spoke about, I can't remember if it was on air or off air, the sources in this whole 50-year period are just, especially in Thucydides, they're just summarized. You have no detail, and I think that's what we spoke about, like things historians such as Diodorus and Plutarch, they help fill in a lot of details, but we have to keep in mind too, you're dealing with historians that are writing 500 to 600 years later, and Diodorus especially a lot of areas, and the Greek and Persian Wars in this sort of area, is often seen as not entirely reliable with some of the facts that he's given, and there are some areas that you can quite easily see that he's confused with areas, but he still does form an excellent supplementary to try and fill out some of the details and provide a bit more food for thought on maybe what was happening as well.
Yeah, well, I think if you didn't have Diodorus, you probably wouldn't really have any sort of, concerted narrative throughout that period. Like you say, Plutarch obviously covers some of the more prominent Greeks in the area, but the events in and around, like Plutarch gets bogged down in the detail. Like you get, obviously because Plutarch was dealing with so many accounts, you get sometimes 5 or 6 different stories about the same event. And you can often get lost in the detail there, and it's very hard to piece together a concise narrative through that sort of style. Diodorus at least gives you some, but like you say, he's very conflicted with with A, what he's talking about, and B, how accurate the information he's relaying actually is. It's a difficult period, so I bet you'd be glad to finish up with that.
Yeah, well, so I've just done the 30 years piece, and I'm actually just about finished writing an episode on the Samian War. So,
right,
and getting into all that sort of stuff now. And so basically, it's kind of the lead up, I guess, now to how events are going to unfold to leading to the actual Great Peloponnesian War. Which,
well, hopefully we get some opportunity to talk to each other about the Peloponnesian War, and hopefully we'll get in there maybe midway through next year. So it'll be good to be able to do a collaborative episode somewhere in there.
Yeah, I actually thought I was going to get to it this year, but I didn't.
So did I.
And that was one of the. It was on purpose too, because when I was looking through, I was like, there's so much not known about this whole period, and I thought, you know what, I just want to spend a bit of time, even if it's not all fact and pure history. I want to at least present ideas of maybe what was happening, or if buts and maybes and supposedlys. There's a lot of those through my episodes. So, and from what the feedback I've got, people have enjoyed that, where there's been a bit more information on that whole period. So it's been good. So I can't imagine how long it's going to take me to get through the actual Peloponnesian War.
Are you going to do an episode per year, you think?
Take year by year.
Yeah. That'll be fun. That'll keep you going until about 2030.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
I'll be giving it a go.
Yeah. Anyway, I guess we've been talking for quite a while. It's getting pretty late here, and I suppose, and for you as well, you're a bit ahead of me. But so I guess that's kind of where I'm going in the future with my plans. What about yourself? Where's Spartan History Podcast heading at this point?
Yeah. I think, I mean, obviously our trajectories are probably pretty similar in that regard. Once I finish the Greco-Persian Wars, there's obviously the Spartan, the earthquake in Sparta, the day the earth moved there. There's the primary parts of the Peloponnesian War. I'll get involved a little bit, trying to paint the narratives of the kings that were ruling, throughout that period, because, once you sort of leave Pausanias and Leothicus, it's almost a complete gap in the Spartan narrative until Archidamus sort of comes onto the scene with the Peloponnesian War. So I'm going to try and sort of flesh those areas out, but I think I'll come up against the same problems with you. But with the Peloponnesian War, that's the next big project that I'll be going for. And I'm going to be taking it from a really different perspective. Like my plan is to not call it the Peloponnesian War. I'm going to call it the Delian War. Mm-hmm. I think it was called the Peloponnesian War because it's written by Athenian sources against the Peloponnesian League. I'm going to be called the Delian War, the Delian War, because it's primarily Sparta against the Delian League. And I'm going to try as best as I can to pick out only Spartan sources, only Spartan references, and tell the story from a completely Spartan side. So that's sort of going to be, my next big project. Hopefully get started on it somewhere between the middle and the end of next year. We'll see how we go from there first.
That will be interesting, and definitely interesting to have a chat once we've both sort of approached it in those different ways as well.
Yeah. We'll get there, and while I've got your audience, I'll remind them that we've got Paul Cartledge coming up next at the Battle of Thermopylae. We've got Paul Bardonius, who's one of my lovely friends who it's very enjoyable to talk to, on the Battle of Plataea, and Steve Hodkinson, sort of encapsulating Sparta at the time of the Peloponnesian War. So there's some good interviews to come.
Yeah, very good to hear. And where can everyone find Spartan History Podcast? Sorry,
you just cut out entirely.
Yeah, you just cut out too. Sorry.
Oh God. Yeah.
So where can we people go to find your episodes on Spartan History Podcast?
Well, if you look at where casting through ancient Greece sits on any sort of podcast list, if you look maybe 50 or 60 podcasts lower, you'll find me. But no, wherever you find good podcasts, so look for Spartan History Podcast or SpartanHistoryPodcast.com.
And you're on Twitter and Facebook?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter and Facebook as well. Yep. Yeah, reach out if you've got any crazy Spartan questions to ask. I'll do my best to answer them.
Yep. Good to hear. Well, everyone, I hope you enjoyed our chat together. It's basically was my just idea to just see out the end of the year just with a casual talk with Steve. We often do talk offline, through Messenger and whatnot, but it's been quite a while since we've spoken live over air, so it's been good to catch up again. And it was good to be able to revisit the Greek and Persian Wars now that you've got into this area as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Mark. It's always a pleasure to talk history with you, and I'm a big fan of what you're doing over there. So keep up the good work, and more than happy to come back on and chew the fat with you anytime.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Steve. And we'll have to definitely not leave it as long as we did this time.
Let's bank on it. Let's do it, mate. And Merry Christmas too.
Merry Christmas to you. Cheers.
Thanks, mate.
Thank you, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed the chat that I had with Steve. I always have a great time catching up with him. I'm hoping we make this a bit more of a regular occurrence. Remember to check out Steve's show, the Spartan History Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts from. So that is it for 2022. I'll be taking the rest of December and January off. Though, for you Patreon members, keep an eye out for the next bonus episode that will come out in the first week of January. In the narrative in the main series, we just finished the end of the First Peloponnesian War, so next year we'll be returning with the developments afterwards and the road towards the Peloponnesian War. I greatly appreciate all the support I have received from you all over the past year, and I hope you continue to enjoy the series going into 2023. So have a safe and happy holiday period, and I will see you again in the new year.